On the 22nd of June, 1941, before dawn, headquarters of Army Group Center were issuing final orders, as if the outcome of the entire campaign had already been decided on paper. Officers of the Wehrmacht received maps marked with the lines where the offensive was supposed to halt of its own accord, somewhere beyond Smolensk, at most at the walls of Moscow, and certainly before the onset of the autumn mud season. 3,800,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and about 2,700 combat aircraft were to decide the fate of the Eastern Campaign within mere weeks. Down below, in the starting positions along the entire border from the Baltic to the Black Sea, thousands of soldiers still did not know precisely where they were being led, and some of them would not survive even the first month of this war. The main question of this story is not that the plan collapsed, but when exactly the people who gave the order first felt they had miscalculated. To understand how the most prepared army in Europe lost its confidence in an easy victory within a single day, one must return to where that confidence was first born, to the offices where the plan for the Eastern Campaign was drawn in pencil on a map, still unaware of the sound of real war on this land. If you are interested in how this conviction shattered against reality on the very first day, watch to the end. It gets more interesting. On the 18th of December, 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Directive No. 21, the plan for the operation codenamed Barbarossa. The wording was brief and cold. The German armed forces must be prepared to crush the Soviet Union in a swift campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. This very sentence revealed the logic of the entire concept. The Eastern Campaign was conceived not as a separate protracted war, but as a short military operation fitted into the schedule of the already ongoing campaign in the West. Planners from the Army General Staff proceeded from the recent experience of Poland and France. Massive armored thrusts, encirclement of the enemy's main forces in the border zone, and thereafter, a march through a virtually defeated country. The calculation was based on the Red Army accepting a decisive battle right at the border, being encircled and destroyed within the first 6 to 8 weeks, after which the Wehrmacht would simply occupy territory up to the conditional line Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan, meeting almost no organized resistance in the country's interior. From January, the transfer of divisions from west to east began, and it was done in an atmosphere of total deception. They lied not only to the enemy, but to their own soldiers, and even to part of the senior officer corps. The troop transfer to Poland and East Prussia was officially explained by the need for defense against a possible Soviet strike. Some units were assured they were being withdrawn for rest before the landing on the British Isles as part of Operation Sea Lion. Others were told about a transfer across Soviet territory to Persia and further to Africa against English colonies. To yet others, that routine maneuvers on new training grounds were ahead. The Balkan campaign in the spring of '41, the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, gave the command additional and absolutely natural cover. The transfer of troops east could now be explained as regrouping after the Balkan operations. From March, defensive structures, trenches, bunkers, fortified firing points began to be demonstratively erected along the border to convince Soviet intelligence of the purely defensive nature of the troop concentration. According to the directive of the High Command Headquarters of the 8th of May, officers were allowed to be informed of the true objective of the campaign no earlier than 8 days before the start of the operation, and the rank-and-file and non-commissioned officers only immediately before moving to the border. On the 10th of June, the troops allocated for Barbarossa began moving to concentration areas, and a week later the divisions of the first echelon were already occupying starting positions along the border. By the evening of the 21st of June, the deployment was practically complete, including the Strategic Reserve. 183 divisions and 13 brigades were concentrated on the border with the Soviet Union. On paper, the plan looked mathematically flawless. Overwhelming superiority in tempo, the element of surprise, the tank thrust tactics perfected in the 2 previous campaigns, and absolute confidence that the Soviet military machine would collapse as quickly as the French army had a year earlier. It was precisely in this confidence that the main miscalculation of the entire operation lay. German military intelligence, the Foreign Armies East Department, by June of 41 estimated the strength of the Red Army at approximately 150 to 170 divisions, scattered along a vast front. Historians who later studied the archives of this department noted that the actual number, including forming and reserve formations, turned out to be significantly higher. The Soviet command had a mobilization reserve, the existence of which German headquarters either did not know about or consciously underestimated its combat capability. The Barbarossa plan was built on the idea of one decisive battle right at the border, after which organized resistance was supposed to cease. It completely failed to account for the Soviet system's ability to form new armies literally on the move, to replace those destroyed in the cauldrons of the first weeks. And it was precisely this ability that would determine the entire further course of the campaign of 1941. The second blind spot was distance and the logistics associated with it. German staff maps, accustomed to the scales of Western Europe, poorly conveyed the true extent of the Eastern theater of war. From the border to Moscow, more than 1,000 kilometers, and this distance had to be covered not on paved French highways, but on dirt tracks that turned into a viscous mess after the first serious rain. A separate and far more prosaic problem was the railway gauge width. The Soviet gauge was wider than the European one, and captured tracks had to be physically re-gauged by hand before German supply trains with fuel and ammunition could run on them. The pace of advance of the tank groups regularly outpaced the supply unit's ability to deliver fuel. Trucks designed for European distances and European roads simply physically could not keep up with the rapidly growing distance between the front line and rear depots. Staff calculations assumed the army would be supplied primarily by captured Soviet trophies and local resources, a calculation that would lead to serious disruptions within the first weeks. The third, and perhaps the most fatal miscalculation, concerned not logistics or technology, but man. The German command prepared for war against a state machine, against headquarters, depots, airfields, and communication lines. It hardly prepared for war against a soldier who would fight even when, from a purely military point of view, the battle was already lost. The experience of Poland and France convinced the Wehrmacht that encircled units would capitulate as soon as they lost the chance for organized resistance and contact with their command. This same template was mechanically applied to the Eastern Front, with no adjustment made for a different military culture or for the different degree of readiness of the ordinary soldier to fight in a knowingly hopeless situation. The intelligence reports of the pre-war months contained practically no analysis of the morale and motivation of the Soviet soldier, only figures on divisions, guns, and tanks. It was this gap, and not a shortage of fuel or maps, that would determine the nature of the first day of the war. For most ordinary Germans, both civilians and soldiers, the very fact of war with the Soviet Union came as a complete surprise. After the conclusion of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the Soviet press and German propaganda had for almost 2 years been harping on about economic cooperation and good neighborly relations between the two countries. First Lieutenant Wilhelm Prühler, whose frontline diary was later published by historians, recalled that right up until the last days before the invasion, complete uncertainty reigned in the units. Soldiers speculated whether they were being led to rest, to new maneuvers, or further south, to India via Soviet territory. Moving in night marches, mostly in darkness to avoid aerial reconnaissance, units reached the border with Lithuania and East Prussia literally just days before the start of the war, and most rank-and-file soldiers learned the objective of the campaign only when hours, not days, remained until dawn. Lieutenant Gottfried Ewert recalled that during the march, dozens of mutually exclusive rumors circulated among the troops, and the idea of an attack specifically on the Soviet Union seemed to him the least likely of all versions until the very last moment. Some recalled other moods as well. Some officers referred to Hitler's previous statements that Germany's future lay in the East, and that there too was the living space so lacking for the German people. Others were convinced that Bolshevism was a threat they would have to face sooner or later, and it was better to do it sooner, while the strategic initiative was on Germany's side. Infantryman Rupert Schillinger described the mood in the troops as vague and heterogeneous. There was a feeling that things were heading towards some kind of war, but the soldiers felt no particular enthusiasm about it.
Another veteran, whose recollections were recorded after the war, said that tension truly hung in the air, but no one seriously considered a war specifically in the summer of '41. Most believed that they first had to finish matters with Britain, and only then, at some indefinite future time, might the turn of the East come. On the evening of June 21st, Hitler's address to the troops began to be read out in the units of the first echelon. It spoke of the beginning of the campaign against world Bolshevism, of the fate of Europe and the German Empire, which was now allegedly in the hands of the soldiers standing at their starting positions. The wording was designed to give each individual soldier a personal responsibility for the outcome of the entire campaign. A classic propaganda technique turning an abstract political goal into a personal, almost religious duty. The night, the forward units spent at their starting positions, awaiting the signal to begin the artillery preparation scheduled for 3:15 in the morning. Officer Walter Laus, whose unit was positioned on the western bank of the border river Bug, recalled that the final hours before the invasion passed in complete, almost unnatural silence. The soldiers checked their equipment in silence, as if afraid to scare away luck with conversation. The first minutes of the war passed exactly as the German General Staff had planned. At 3:15 in the morning, thousands of artillery barrels opened fire along the entire borderline from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Within minutes, Luftwaffe bombers took to the air, striking airfields, communication hubs, and the deployment sites of Soviet border units. By noon, more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed at the airfields of the western districts, most of them right on the ground, which almost immediately gave the German Air Force almost complete air supremacy. Tank groups crossed the border rivers practically without resistance, and the first reports arriving at headquarters sounded extremely optimistic. The enemy was caught by surprise, fortifications captured, losses minimal, the pace of the advance exceeding even the most optimistic pre-war calculations. But by midday, the nature of the reports began to change, and this is best seen in the example of one particular sector of the front, the Brest Fortress. It was to be stormed by the 45th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, at full strength, about 17,000 men, supported by heavy artillery and assault guns. The fortress garrison, seriously thinned after the sudden artillery strike, numbered, according to various estimates, from 7,000 to 9,000 men, a significant portion of whom were caught right in their barracks, in their underwear, without weapons at hand. The first reports from German officers indeed recorded success. By 5 in the morning, the bridges across the Bug were captured, the outer fortifications taken, dozens of prisoners caught by the war right in their beds. But just a few hours later, the tone of the reports became completely different. Scattered groups of Soviet soldiers, left without communication and unified command, took refuge in the casemates of the Citadel and the Kobrin fortification and continued to hold their positions, repelling one attack after another. By the evening of the first day, the 45th Division had lost more personnel than during the entire French campaign the year before. Losses in killed and wounded numbered in the hundreds in a single day of fighting around one fortress. The assault, which according to plan was supposed to take a few hours, stretched into a week, and individual pockets of resistance in the casemates and basements held out for about another month after the start of the war. The example of the Brest Fortress is notable precisely because the most documents about it have survived, and it was later studied in detail by historians, including using captured German combat journals. But a similar picture, albeit on a smaller scale, repeated itself along the entire front line. On most sectors, the German offensive indeed developed successfully. Armored wedges broke through the defense and penetrated dozens of kilometers deep into Soviet territory on the very first day. But wherever Soviet units managed to occupy a defense in fortified points, at border outposts, in the pillboxes of fortified areas, in individual settlements, German commanders recorded unexpectedly stubborn resistance, accompanied by tangible losses of their own. The commander of the 8th Army Corps, General Walter von Heitz, noted in his report that individual strongpoints could only be taken after a systematic, meticulously prepared assault, which came at a significant cost. A dry staff formulation,
But behind it lay the admission that an easy stroll had failed to materialize, even on the very first day of the war. On the southern flank, in the sector of Army Group South, advancing towards Lviv and Przemysl, German units encountered a similar problem. Border outposts, whose garrisons rarely exceeded a few dozen men, offered resistance disproportionate to their numbers. Many outposts held out for hours against superior forces, although from a military standpoint, there was not the slightest chance of holding the position. In the staff documents of the German 6th Army for the first day of the war, there are mentions that certain border posts had to be literally burned out with flamethrowers, as the garrison refused to withdraw or surrender, even after the outpost building had been practically destroyed by artillery. What proved most unusual for the German soldiers was not the resistance itself, but its nature. The number of prisoners taken on the first day of the war was catastrophically low by the standards of all previous Wehrmacht campaigns. Neither in Poland nor in France had German units encountered a situation where surrounded and isolated enemy soldiers continued to fight to the last bullet and then went into hand-to-hand combat. A tank crewman from one of Army Group Center's divisions wrote in his diary that Soviet soldiers almost never surrendered because they fought to the last man. When ammunition ran out, they used rifle butts, and if their rifles were knocked from their hands, the soldiers charged with knives or bare fists. The commander of one infantry battalion, Major Neuhoff, later admitted to his comrades that he could not believe his own eyes, watching a handful of 5 or 6 Red Army men attack his battalion's positions, perfectly aware they had no chance of success. From a purely military perspective, it looked like suicide, but such attacks were repeated again and again on different sectors of the front. An artilleryman from one of Army Group North's anti-tank batteries recorded in his diary an episode later often retold in the memoirs of Wehrmacht officers. A knocked-out light Soviet tank, the T-26, unexpectedly came back to life. A wounded tanker emerged from the turret hatch and opened fire with his pistol at the approaching German soldiers. When the shooting stopped and they approached the vehicle, it turned out the tanker had lost both legs to a shell hit, and despite this, he had kept firing to the last bullet. An Obergefreiter from one of the tank regiments described a similar case. A burning Soviet tank whose crew continued to fire its machine gun until the vehicle was completely engulfed in flames. And he himself wrote a short phrase in his diary that these Russian tankers were brave, and this was the first such admission made by a German soldier in this war. A military doctor from one of the infantry divisions noted in his diary that wounded Soviet soldiers brought to dressing stations behaved differently than French prisoners had a year earlier. Many refused medical aid or tried to attack the medics, mistaking an outstretched hand for another trap. A pilot from one of the dive bomber squadrons who participated in the morning raids on border airfields recalled that by the evening of the 22nd of June, the anti-aircraft fire from the ground had become noticeably denser and more accurate than in the morning. In his words, he got the impression that the enemy was learning to fight literally in the process of the first day of battle, rather than acting according to outdated regulations, as had been the case in France. Here it is worth pausing on one figure which conveys the scale of the gap between the expectations of the German command and what was happening on the ground better than any description. On the first day of the war, according to German reports themselves, the number of prisoners taken on most sectors of the front was counted in tens and hundreds of men, whereas on the similarly scaled first day of the French campaign, the count was in thousands of prisoners for the same period. Not thousands, tens and hundreds. Tens and hundreds of prisoners across an entire front stretching 1,500 kilometers. It was this figure, and not general words about the enemy's bravery, that for the first time made Wehrmacht staff officers think they were facing not an army that would prefer captivity to death at the first opportunity, but something fundamentally different, for which German military manuals simply had no ready formulation. By the evening of the 22nd of June, even the German Armed Forces High Command was forced to acknowledge in its official communiqué that the enemy, having recovered from the initial confusion, was beginning to offer increasingly stubborn resistance. An almost sensational formulation by Army standards, considering the overconfidence with which German staff documents were compiled in the first year of the war. The Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Colonel General Franz Halder,
recorded similar conclusions in his personal diary in those days. According to his observations, Russian units retreated only under pressure from clearly superior forces and fought to the last man, while constantly seeking an opportunity for a flank attack and trying to cut off the advancing tank groups from the infantry following them. On certain sectors of the front, he noted, the situation was so confused that it was already difficult to tell who was actually encircling whom, an entry military historians later often cited as the first official admission by the German generals that pre-war calculations had gone seriously awry. The difference between what division commanders wrote in official reports and what rank-and-file soldiers and non-commissioned officers recorded in their personal diaries became apparent precisely on the first day of the war. Headquarters reported upward about the completion of daily objectives, about advances of tens of kilometers, about the destruction of enemy border groupings. The figures were indeed impressive, and formally Operation Barbarossa was proceeding almost on schedule on the first day. But in the soldiers' diaries, a completely different tone already appeared on the 22nd of June. Weariness, bewilderment, the first doubts that the campaign would really end in a few weeks, as propaganda had promised before the move to the border. One signals officer wrote that evening that in a single day on this soil, he had seen more stubbornness from the enemy than in the entire French campaign, and that the feeling of a quick and easy victory with which he had crossed the border in the morning had disappeared without a trace by evening. What did German soldiers feel when, after several hours of battle, they realized that before them was not a demoralized army ready to surrender at the first opportunity, but something else? An enemy who would rather die than retreat without orders. Judging by surviving diaries and letters, the prevailing feeling was not contempt or panic, but confusion mixed with a grim, almost professional respect. Historians who later studied archival frontline letters from the first weeks of the war noted a characteristic detail: the word fanaticism, which German propaganda later used to describe Soviet resistance, is almost absent in the private letters of soldiers from June and July of '41. The words stubbornness, fortitude, and a bewildered acknowledgement that the enemy was not behaving as he was supposed to, according to all pre-war instructions and manuals, appear much more frequently. Thus ended the first of 1,418 days of a war that would claim the lives of more than 27 million Soviet citizens, and conclude with the complete military defeat of Nazi Germany. Formally, the 22nd of June was a victorious day for the Wehrmacht. The front line advanced dozens of kilometers. The enemy's air force suffered severe losses. Tens of thousands of Soviet servicemen found themselves encircled in the very first border pockets. But it was on this day, and not near Moscow or Stalingrad, that a formulation first appeared in the diaries of German soldiers and in the personal notes of the Chief of the General Staff, which would become commonplace for the entire Wehrmacht within a few months. Before us is not a defeated country, but an opponent for whom retreat without an order is tantamount to disgrace, and captivity is not salvation, but a new form of defeat. It would not be an exaggeration to say that already on the evening of the 22nd of June, some German officers, reading reports not for briefing superiors but for themselves, began to understand. The promised easy and victorious stroll to the east would not happen, even if the plan for the first day was formally fulfilled. Despite the significant advance deep into Soviet territory in the very first hours, the feeling that the troops were marching through a defeated country, that very feeling which accompanied the Wehrmacht in France, did not arise among the soldiers or the majority of mid-level staff officers. The 22nd of June, 1941, became the day when two completely different conceptions of war first met face-to-face on the same patch of land. One believed in blitzkrieg and technical superiority as the ultimate argument. The other was simply defending its home, not particularly interested in the enemy's staff calculations. The genius of a plan is born in headquarters, over a map with neat blue arrows. Fortitude is not born there, it is born in a trench, with a man who has nothing to shoot with but nowhere to retreat. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the German army, for the first time in this war, encountered an opponent who had not read their military textbooks. And it turned out that this very ignorance of textbooks decided the outcome of an entire campaign.